always make me feel very welcome, and Dave too. And we're glad to see anybody here on a morning like this. It's really very nice of you to come out. Yes, I am going to talk about poverty, and I'm going to start. I don't teach this way at the University of Maryland, which is, after all, a state school and rather secular in its outlook. But I'm going to start with a little scripture reading for you. Inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me. And that's from Matthew, and you all know that. And he's talking about the poor at that point. Poverty is both an economic issue, but it's also a moral one. And I know you understand that here at St. Andrews because you do a lot of good outreach in this general area. There are 39.7 million Americans experiencing poverty, according to census data and reported by Brookings. That's a lot of people in the United States. Now, let me say some things about the 19th century in Britain and the 21st century here. In the 19th century, Great Britain was the richest and most powerful country in the world. In the 21st century, that's what we are, currently at least. But both Britain and the United States had serious pockets of poverty throughout their own country, and you certainly have that. The 19th century folks were dealing with economic dislocations being caused by the Industrial Revolution. We are dealing with economic dislocations being caused by globalism and international trade issues. In the 19th century, there were gender issues and power issues, particularly concerning the marriage laws and the rights of women to own property. We certainly have a lot of flux in gender issues in this country right now. In the 19th century in Britain, there were science disputes. After all, that's where Darwin was. And Darwin is still with us in the 21st century. People do not agree about Darwin and global change and evolution and a lot of other things. There was pollution of the environment in the 19th century in Britain. People were concerned particularly about the rivers being so polluted. We have the CO2 pollution to worry about in our century. In the 19th century, Britain was involved in a lot of small-scale wars, gunboat diplomacy, trying to police the rest of the world. We are trying to police third world countries often and get into trouble over that. And in the 19th century, Britain had some pretty disastrous policies in the Middle East. Draw the conclusions on that one too. Okay. I wanted to bring you up to date on some poverty definitions. These are rather general definitions, and then we'll get back into the 19th century a bit. But in general, poverty is a relative issue. In other words, it's economic inequality. Some people have a lot, and some people don't have a lot. And as the standard of living increases for those who have, then the poverty line moves up for those who don't have. In other words, a slum in, say, Washington, D.C. is not quite the same thing as a slum in Rio de Janeiro. They're both poor, but the folks in Rio would be happy, I think, to be in some of the slums in Washington because they're living in real shacks. So it's relative, and it fluctuates some. However, there is a point of absolute poverty called destitution. And that's without the basic human needs of food, water, sanitation, clothing, shelter, health care, and so on. In this century, sub-Saharan Africa has the highest incidence of this kind of destitution right now. And Africa is going to continue to be a very serious problem for quite a long time. When people are in poverty, it affects their health, and particularly women and children are at risk in health issues, maternal death and disease, and so on. So it's not just a lack of food, but it's a lack of care and lack of opportunity all over the place. Okay, so destitution is the really worst kind of poverty. Back in 1975, a guy named Murray Edelson came up with two myths about poverty, both of them incomplete, and let me explain what they are. The first one was myth number one is the sufferer, the person who's poor, is responsible for his own plight. He is lazy, and the authorities must protect society from dangerous people like this. And the social structure is basically sound, and its political and economic institutions are sound, and they are not responsible for people being in poverty. And the solution of, if you believe this particular form of the myth, is to change the poor people's attitude about poverty, get them thinking about working in jobs, all these lazy people who are shirking their responsibilities. That's myth number one. Myth number two is that the sufferer, the person poor, is a victim of the elites in the country who benefit from his deprivations. The authorities help the elites maintain their privileges and social structure, and it basically exploits the poor. So that the solution, if you believe this myth, is to change the social order. The first myth, you change the person. The second myth, you change the social order. Now, these are both myths because they're incomplete, and a little of everything is involved in dealing with poverty, not just a single issue. But you will see these solutions coming up, being proposed by politicians from time to time. Get these shirkers into work, or no, we need to reform so much we can't even deal with it, or and so on. So these two myths need to be identified and avoided, and it's more complex than that, isn't everything else? Like the kingdom of heaven. Very complex. Okay, in the 19th century, there were some stereotypes and schemas, that is to say, expectations about people in poverty, what they look like and how they behave. And these are some characteristics I'm going to read to you, and then we'll hand out, with the assistance of my TA over here, some readings that you will pay attention to these, so you see if you can find them in the readings. Poverty in the 19th century in Britain was associated with bad smells, pollution, lack of sanitation. Okay? But poverty was also seen as a sort of disease, which is kind of, if you got too close to it, you'd catch it. And that's, so you want to keep these poor at a distance. In many cases, however they were living, the poor often had a lack of furniture. Now, there are several reasons for that, but one is they didn't have the money to buy the furniture. The second is that the furniture they had, they pawned. So typically there was very little furnishings in the places where the poor were living. The 19th century tended to think of the poor as sort of not quite human. They were animals. And related to that, poverty was seen as a crime, and they were criminals. They were sort of subhuman in their language. They grunted and were violent. And often where they were living, and anything associated with them was dark, not enough light. So this is the scheme or the stereotypes. And so now we'll get into some ways that they were being carried out. These are readings largely from a group of novels that were written around 1840 and 1850. 1840 was a particularly bad time in Britain. It was called the Hungry Forties at that time, and a part of it was the famine in Ireland in 1845 was sending people not only to the United States, but also right across the Irish Sea to Britain. Many desperately poor people in destitute poverty. Be friendly with people, Sharon. Thank you. We're happy to have such a nice group. We weren't sure there would be anybody here this morning. Okay. The first selection is by Charles Dickens. It was written in 1842. This is not from a novel, but this is from his book, American Notes. He was in this country and in this state in 1842, and it's a fun book to read. But this is a selection from a section about New York City. He wanted to see some of the poor of New York City, and they took him to such a rough area that he needed to have a police escort to get in there. So this is what he wrote. Remember that Dickens was a reporter long before he was a novelist, so he notices the details, and he's reporting them here. See if you can pick up some of those things I told you about people expecting to hear or see. What place is this to which the squalid street conducts us? A kind of square of leprous houses, some of which are attainable only by crazy wooden stairs without. What lies beyond this tottering flight of steps that creak beneath our tread? A miserable room lighted by one dim candle, there's the darkness, and destitute of all comfort save that which may be hidden in a wretched bed. Beside it sits a man, his elbows on his knees, his forehead hidden in his hands. What ails that man? Asked the foremost officer. Fever, he sullenly replies without looking up. Conceive the fancies of a fevered brain in such a place as this. Ascend these pitch-dark stairs, heedful of a false footing on the trembling boards, and grope your way with me into this wolfish den. There's the animal again. Where neither ray of light nor breath of air appears to come. A Negro lad, startled from his sleep by the officer's voice, he knows it well, but is comforted by his assurance that he has not come on business, officiously bestirs himself to light a candle. The match flickers for a moment and shows great mounds of dusty rags on the ground, then dies away and leaves a denser darkness than before, if there can be degrees in such extremes. He stumbles down the stairs and presently comes back, shading a flaring taper with his hand. Then the mound of rags seems to be astir and rise slowly up, and the floor is covered with heaps of Negro women. By the way, race, of course, is always a complicating factor in dealing with poverty in this country. This is a group of blacks in New York. Waking from their sleep, their white teeth chattering, their eyes glistening and winking on all sides with surprise and fear, like the countless repetition of one astonished African face in some strange mirror. Mount up these other stairs with no less cautions, and I'm not going to go any farther, but this, at the end of the corner, as you glance about you, where dogs would howl to lie, women and men and boys slink off to sleep, forcing the dislodged rats and to move in quest of better lodging for the rats. So this is New York in 1842, and a description by Charles Dickens, rather gripping. The next selection is by Benjamin Disraeli. Now, Disraeli, of course, was Prime Minister of England later on, but before he was Prime Minister, he wrote novels, and he virtually invented the political novel, which makes sense. He really understood politics. He isn't a great novelist, but because he was Prime Minister later on, it's interesting to read some of his novels, and one of the most famous one is Sybil, or The Two Nations, which is his whole theme, really. And he talks in the first selection about some rural poverty, which was pretty bad in those days, too. And he has a fictional town called Woodgate, and he talks about there are no others at Woodgate to preach or to control it. It is not that the people are immoral, for immorality implies some forethought, or ignorant, for ignorance is relative, but they are animals. This is Disraeli saying that the poor are animals. Unconscious in their minds, a blank, and their worst actions only the impulse of a gross or savage instinct. There are many in this town who are ignorant of their very names, very few who can spell them. It is rare that you meet with a young person who knows his own age. Rarer to find a boy who has seen a book or a girl who has seen a flower. Ask them the name of their sovereign and they will give you an unmeaning stare. Ask them the name of their religion and they will laugh. Who rules them on earth and who can save them in heaven are alike mysteries to them. And we have at every fourth or fifth house, alley, seldom about a yard wide and streaming with filth. Again, all this bad smells. Opened out on the street, they were crowded with dwellings of various sizes, while from the principal court often branched out in a number of smaller alleys and rather narrow passages. And then we have at the end the reservoirs of leprosy and plague, and those exhalations, that is to say smells, bad smells, were sufficient to taint the atmosphere of the whole kingdom and fill the country with fever and pestilence. A little later on in the Sybil, or the two nations, we have an interchange between Egremont, who is the hero, and some strangers, and this is the very most famous part of this novel here. He says, Egremont says, your inference, and the response is, that society, still in its infancy, is beginning to feel its way. This is a new reign, said Egremont. Victoria has just come to the throne. Perhaps it is a new era. I think so, said the younger stranger. I hope so, said the older one. Well, society may be in its infancy, said Egremont, slightly smiling, but say what you will, what you like. Our queen reigns over the greatest nation that ever existed. Which nation? Asked the younger stranger, for she reigns over two. The stranger paused. Egremont was silent, but looked inquiringly. Yes, resumed the younger stranger after a moment's interval. Two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets, who are formed by different breeding, fed by different food, are ordered by different manners, and are not governed by the same laws. You speak of, said Egremont hesitatingly, the rich and the poor. Two nations in one country, the rich and the poor. They do not understand each other, and they do not have much sympathy for each other. By a prime minister. Interesting. Okay, the next one is by Mary Barton is the name of the novel, and it's by Elizabeth Gaskell, and was written in 1848. Now, Elizabeth Gaskell was the wife of a Unitarian minister in Manchester. He had the biggest church in Manchester and was very good and very popular. As a minister's wife, she visited the poor in the city, and she was very knowledgeable about how the poor were living in Manchester. Now, Manchester was one of the first of the great manufacturing cities and was experiencing the Industrial Revolution before almost any other part of England. And she is in Mary Barton. She's writing about the factory workers with great insights. And at this point, one worker is so ill he can no longer work, and two of his friends are coming to try to help him. And this next selection from Mary Barton. She goes down Berry Street. She's quite specific about where she is in Manchester. It was unpaved, and down the middle, a gutter forced its way every now and then, forming pools in the holes in which people abounded. Never was the old Edinburgh cry of Garde Low more necessary than in this street. As they passed, women from their doors tossed household slops of every description into the gutter. They ran into the next pool, which overflowed and stagnated. Heaps of ashes were the stepping stones on which the passers-by, who cared in the least for cleanliness, took care not to put his foot. Our friends were not dainty, these are the two other workers, but even they picked their way until they got to some steps leading down into a small area where a person standing would have his head about 1 foot below the level of the street and might at the same time, without the least motion of his body, touch the window of the cellar and the damp, muddy wall right opposite. If you went down one step even from the foul area into the cellar in which a family of human beings lived, it was very dark inside. The window panes were, many of them, broken and stuffed with rags, which was the reason enough for the dusky light that pervaded the place, and even at midday. After the account I have given of the state of the street, no one can be surprised that I'm going into the cellar and have it right Davenport, he's the guy you see. The smell was so fetid as almost to knock the two men down. Quickly recovering themselves, as those inured to such things do, they began to penetrate the thick darkness of the place and to see 3 or 4 little children rolling on a damp, nay, wet brick floor through which the stagnant, filthy moisture of the street oozed up. The fireplace was empty and black. The woman sat on her husband's lair, here he is as a beast, and cried into the dank loneliness. Very, very bleak basement living for the factory workers. And once you got sick, you were really out of luck. That's a low unemployment insurance. Charles Kingsley, in 1850, was writing a novel called Alton Locke. It's a fine novel. Charles Kingsley also wrote The Water Baby, if you know that as a child. It's kind of fun. He was an Anglican clergyman, and a very liberal one, and he was very concerned about slum living conditions in London and tried to do some things about it. This is a description of some of the workers in sweatshops working in London. London did not have a lot of factories in it. The factories were in Manchester and Leeds and Birmingham and places like that. London had the ports, and it had banking, and it had a lot of this kind of people working in sweatshops. He's going through the London shops, tailor shops, and he stopped at the end of a miserable blind alley where a dirty gas lamp just served to make darkness visible. Notice how dark all of these are. This is one of the images that lingers with poverty in 19th century, and shows the patched windows and rickety doorways of the crazy houses whose upper stories were lost in a brooding cloud of fog, and the pools of stagnant water at our feet, and the huge heap of cinders which filled up the waste end of the alley, a dreary black formless mountain on which 2 or 3 spectral dogs prowled up and down after the awful, appearing and vanishing like dark imps in and out of the black misty chaos beyond. The neighborhood was undergoing, as it seemed, improvements of that peculiar metropolitan species which consist in pulling down the dwellings of the poor and building up rich men's houses instead. This is slum clearance in its early stages. And great buildings within high temporary palings had already eaten up half the little houses as the great fish and the great estates and the great shopkeepers eat up the little ones of their species by the law of competition, lately discovered to be the true creator and preserver of the universe. Moving on down, they're looking for someone, and Downs, one of the people, pushed past the unheeding unlocked door at the end of the passage, thrust me and locked it again, and then rushed across the room in chase of 2 or 3 rats who vanished into cracks and holes. And what a room. A low lean-to with wooden walls without a single article of furniture, and through the broad chinks of the floor shone up as if it were ugly glaring eyes staring at us. There were the reflections of the rushlight in the sewer below. In fact, this building was built right over a sewer. The stench was frightful, the air heavy with pestilence. The first breath I drew made my heart sink and my stomach turn, but I forgot everything in the objects which lay before me as Downs tore a half-finished coat off 3 corpses laid side by side in the bare floor. Yeah, nice place to be. Moving on, back to Dickens. This is fiction. One of his great novels is Bleak House. And Joe, the sweeper, the crossing sweeper, is a teenage boy who is very ignorant and very, very poor. Joe lives, that is to say, Joe has not yet died, in a ruinous place known to the like of him by the name of Tom All-Alone's. It is a black, dilapidated street avoided by all decent people, where the crazy houses were seized on, and when their decay was far advanced, by some bold vagrants who, after establishing their own possession, took to laying them out in lodgings. Now these tumbling, this is like some of the crack houses, you know, and empty, abandoned houses that have been left and people take them over for other reasons. Now as these tumbling tenements contained by night a swarm of misery, as on the ruined human wretch, vermin parasites appeared. So these ruined shelters have bred a crowd of foul existence that crawls in and out of gaps in the walls and boards and coils itself to sleep in maggot numbers, where the rain drips in and comes and goes, fetching and carrying fever and sowing more evil in its every footprint than Lord Poodle, Sir Thomas Doodle, and the Duke of Foodle, and all the fine gentlemen in office down to Zoodle shall set it right in 500 years, though born expressly to do it. And then just above the great central concern of this novel, what connection can there be between the place in Lincolnshire, which is an estate, the house in town, the mercury, the sort of powder, and the whereabouts of Joe, the outlaw with the broom? What connection is there between the rich and the poor? And Dickens begins to draw those lines in this novel. It's a great novel. If you haven't read it, rush out to your local library. It'll keep you busy all day. Not sure. The next one, oh yes. I'm going to end up with these little readings, and then we'll have some more discussion if we have time. The next 2 are from George Bernard Shaw. Not quite in the 19th century, but Major Barbara was written a play in 1905. he is doing some amazing things in this play. Barbara is a major in the Salvation Army, which, by the way, was one of the more effective folks working with the poor in London when they invented the Salvation Army was invented in England, and it still does very good work with the very, very poor people. And she is the daughter of an industrialist named Undershaft, and he not only is a big, rich industrialist, he's making armaments. This is right before the First World War. So he's involved in this kind of money making, and she's involved in getting away from all this. And Undershaft talks about his own workers, and he says, I saved their souls just as I saved yours. And she is revolted and says, you saved my soul, what do you mean? And Undershaft says, I fed you and clothed you and housed you. I took care that you should have money enough to live handsomely, more than enough, so that you could be wasteful, careless, generous. That saved your soul from the 7 deadly sins. Barbara is now really bewildered. The 7 deadly sins? Yes, the 7 deadly 7. Food, clothing, firing, rent, taxes, respectability, and children. Nothing can lift those 7 millstones from man's neck but money. And the spirit cannot soar until the millstones are lifted. I lifted them from your spirit. I enabled Barbara to become Major Barbara, and I saved her from the crime of poverty. Do you call poverty a crime? Undershaft. The worst of crimes. All the other crimes are virtues beside it. All the other dishonors are chivalry itself by comparison. Poverty blights whole cities, spreads horrible pestilences, strikes dead the very souls of all who come within sight or sound or smell of it. What you call crime is nothing. A murder here, a theft there, a blow now, a curse then. What do they matter? They are only the accidents and illnesses of life. There are not 50 genuine professional criminals in London, but there are millions of poor people, abject people, dirty people, ill-fed, ill-clothed people. They poison us morally and physically. They kill the happiness of society. They force us to do away with our own liberties and to organize unnatural cruelties for fear they should rise against us and drag us down into their abyss. Only fools fear crime. We all fear poverty. Trust Shaw to turn things around for us. Isn't that amazing? Okay, one last thing, and I think you probably know this one. This is also Bernard Shaw from the play Pygmalion, on which My Fair Lady is based. And you may remember the character of Doolittle, who is the father of Eliza, and he comes to get a little money out of Henry Higgins, who is the professor who is trying to teach Eliza how to speak properly. And Doolittle is talking to talking to Pickering and to Higgins, and he says, don't say that, government, don't look at it that way. What am I, governors both? I ask you, what am I? I'm one of the undeserving poor, that's what I am. Think of what that means to a man. It means he's up against middle-class morality all the time. If there's anything going and I put in for a bit of it, it's always the same story. You're undeserving, so you can't have it. But my needs is as great as the most deserving widows that ever got money out of 6 different charities in 1 week for the death of the same husband. I don't need less than a deserving man, I need more. I don't eat less hearty than him, and I drink a lot more. I want a bit of amusement because I'm a thinking man. I want cheerfulness and a song and a band when I feel low. Will they charge me just the same for everything as they charge the deserving? What is middle-class morality? Just an excuse for never giving me anything. Therefore, I ask you as 2 gentlemen not to play that game on me. I'm playing straight with you. I ain't pretending to be deserving. I'm undeserving, and I mean to go on being undeserving. I like it, and that's the truth. Would you take advantage of a man's nature to do him out of the price of his own daughter, what he's brought up and fed and clothed by the sweat of his brow until she's grown big enough to be interesting to you 2 gentlemen? Is 5 pounds unreasonable? I put it to you, and I leave it to you. This is a very nice distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. Who's to say who's deserving? When people are poor and they need help, they need help. Okay, let's see what we can say about this. How are we doing on time? Yeah, getting close. All right. I do want to say one more thing about about poverty. In the 21st century, there are usually three ways to deal with poverty. One is by band-aiding. Now, by band-aiding, I mean food pantries, soup kitchens, shelters, clothing drives, anything to keep people from freezing to death and dying of exposure on the street. In a civilized country, you can't have people dying out in the gutters of your cities. And you guys do a great job in this band-aiding. It's really, really important. It's the first line of to reach the poor, really. The second is structural change. Structural change is what is done by law. And this is the sort of improvements that can come with unemployment insurance, workers' comp, pensions, child labor laws. These are all things that help safety issues, you know, a safe workplace, this sort of thing. These are all things that do help the poor, but they're done by government and through legal means. And the last one is empowering the poor themselves. This is very scary to most people, and the Victorians simply could not think about this. Empowering the poor is through labor unions, through community organizations, and through education. And you in this town, if you're not empowering people over at Penn State, I don't know who isn't. But these are things, giving the poor the means to deal with their own problems was so scary to the Victorians that they couldn't get into that. The philanthropy and the church and the band-aiding was going on in the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, at full scale. And they began to realize also you need to have government involved in this as well because it's too big a problem. And then the structural changes were also going into effect. Some of the factory acts were limiting the day, and child labor laws were keeping kids out of the factory so they could go to school and so on. These are the structural changes. The empowering the poor and letting the poor run things was just something beyond the Victorians' ability to think. It's a little scary even today. But our great state universities and certainly our community colleges are one of the important ways into the middle class in this country, and they still are. Are there some questions? Yeah.
In the Victorian times, who was thinking about Jesus' message of blessed are the poor? Obviously, none of the writers that you have just quoted from.
Well, yeah, Charles Kingsley certainly was. But let me say this about that. By the middle of the 19th century, a large section of the religious part of England was evangelical, including in the Church of England. Half the Church of England clergy were evangelical. The evangelicals were very good at reaching out and in stopping the slave trade and so on. They were interested in saving the souls of people. They weren't awfully interested in improving the current living conditions. They were thinking about the next world and not improving the living conditions in this world. Charles Kingsley, on the other hand, was trying to get clean water into the slums of London so they didn't have contaminated fresh water to deal with. So whether you work in this world or the next world was one of the issues, and still is, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Good question. Yeah, thank you. Anybody else?